On that stormy night, an old fakir heard desperate knocking at his door. Outside, a trembling young woman, drenched by the rain, begged for shelter. With a heart full of compassion, he believed he was saving an innocent life. But little did he know that by opening that door, he was bringing into his cabin a secret capable of destroying not only his peace, but his very soul. "Please, sir," she whispered with a trembling voice, "I need shelter. Evil men are chasing me through the forest. They want to dishonor me." The fakir's heart filled with compassion. How could he, a servant of Allah, deny help to a soul in suffering? But something within him, an intuition developed through decades of spiritual contemplation, whispered a warning he could not yet understand. Before we continue with this story that will shake your certainties about good and evil, check if you're already subscribed to the channel, and I want you to stop for a moment and reflect. How many times in your life have you encountered situations where appearances were completely deceiving? How many times did what seemed to be a blessing turn out to be a trial, or what seemed to be a problem transformed into a valuable lesson? Baba Ramit was exactly what many of us would like to be, a man who had dedicated his entire life to spiritual growth. Born into a simple farming family, from a young age he showed signs of a contemplative nature that set him apart from his brothers. While they were interested in family business and village festivities, Ramit spent hours watching the sunrise and sunset, questioning himself about the purpose of human existence. At 25, after a mystical experience during a night of intense prayer, he decided to abandon everything: the family inheritance, the possibility of marriage, the comforts of civilized life, to dedicate himself exclusively to the search for spiritual truth. He moved to that cabin in the forest more than 40 years ago, sustaining himself through cultivating a small garden and gathering wild fruits. His routine was rigorously disciplined. He woke before dawn for the morning prayer, dedicated mornings to studying sacred texts, afternoons to the physical work necessary for his survival, and nights to meditation and contemplation. He rarely received visitors except for some lost traveler or villagers who occasionally came seeking spiritual counsel. But now, write in the comments where you are watching this story from. I want to know to which countries these lessons about spiritual discernment are reaching, because what you are about to discover about this night will forever change the way Baba Ramit, and perhaps you too, sees the difference between genuine compassion and spiritual manipulation. The young woman at his door represented the greatest test he would face in decades of contemplative life. With his heart moved by the compassion that decades of spiritual practice had cultivated in his soul, Baba Ramit completely opened the door of his cabin and gestured for the young woman to enter. The cold wind of the storm swept through the interior of the cabin, making the candle flames dance dangerously. "Come in, my daughter," he said with a soft and paternal voice. "No one should be exposed to a storm like this." The young woman, who would later identify herself as Noor, entered slowly, her steps leaving puddles of water on the simple wooden floor. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and she hugged her own body in a vain attempt to warm herself. Baba Ramit immediately sought a clean blanket and a towel, offering them with the natural kindness of one who had dedicated his life to divine service. "Sit near the fire," he instructed, indicating a place close to the fireplace where some embers still emanated heat. "I'll prepare hot tea for you." While Baba Ramit moved around the cabin preparing tea, Noor observed everything with eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the environment. Her eyes lingered for prolonged moments on the sacred books, on the carefully folded prayer rug, on the tasbih, Islamic rosary, that rested on a small wooden table. "Sir," she said with a voice still trembling, but loaded with an emotion that seemed excessively intense, "I was returning from my aunt's house when they surrounded me. 3 men without honor, without fear of Allah. They said horrible things, made proposals that a maiden should never hear." Her tears began to flow freely and her voice broke as she continued. "I managed to escape only because I know this forest well, but they followed me. I heard their screams and threats echoing among the trees. They said that when they found me—" She couldn't finish the sentence, covering her face with her hands in a demonstration of shame and terror. The old fakir's heart filled with righteous anger against those who would dare pursue an innocent young woman, but also with an iron determination to protect her. However, something in his spiritual experience, a sensitivity developed through years of contemplation, caught strange nuances in her story. The intensity of her emotions seemed almost theatrical, the way she observed his reaction to each word, as if measuring the effect of her narrative. But Baba Ramit pushed away these doubts, mentally reproaching himself for questioning the suffering of a soul in affliction. As the hours of the night advanced, and the storm gradually lost its intensity, a peculiar atmosphere settled in the small cabin. Noor had warmed up, and her clothes began to dry near the fire, but something in her behavior began to deeply intrigue Baba Ramit. Initially, she had demonstrated the natural nervousness of someone who had just escaped a terrible danger. Her eyes jumped at every noise from the wind, her hands trembled when holding the teacup, and she constantly looked toward the door as if expecting her pursuers to appear at any moment. But now, after some hours of safety, something different emerged in her behavior. Her eyes, which before seemed frightened and vulnerable, now carried an almost hypnotic intensity. When Baba Ramit wasn't looking directly at her, Noor observed him with an attention that went far beyond the normal gratitude of someone who had received help. It was as if she were studying each of his reactions, cataloguing each expression that crossed his wrinkled face. "Baba," she said softly, using the respectful term that meant father in Arabic, "may I stay here until dawn? I promise I'll leave as soon as the first rays of sun appear. I'm afraid they might still be out there waiting." The question itself was completely reasonable, but the way she asked it, with a voice slightly deeper than before, with a body posture that suggested more confidence than fear, made Baba Ramit feel an inexplicable discomfort run down his spine. During his years of spiritual practice, the old fakir had developed an acute sensitivity to the subtle energies that permeate all human interactions. It was as if he possessed a sixth sense to detect when something wasn't completely aligned with truth. And now, observing Noor as she settled more comfortably near the fire, this internal sense triggered silent alarms. She moved with a grace that seemed studied, almost feline. When she smiled in response to his gentle words, the smile didn't completely reach her eyes. And there were moments, brief instants when she thought he wasn't watching, when her expression changed completely, revealing something much older and more calculating than her apparent 18 years suggested. But what most disturbed Baba Ramit was his own reaction to her presence. After decades of celibacy and rigorous control over his worldly impulses, he found himself noticing details about her that a holy man shouldn't notice. It was in the early hours of dawn, when the storm had transformed into gentle rain and the fire in the fireplace had reduced to warm embers, that Noor finally broke the silence that had settled between them. Baba Ramit was in silent contemplation, his lips moving almost imperceptibly in prayer, when her voice cut through the cabin's quietude like a blade. "Baba," she whispered, and her voice now carried a different quality, deeper, more resonant, as if coming from a much deeper place in her being. "I need to tell you the truth." The old fakir opened his eyes and turned to face her. In the flickering light of the embers, Noor's face seemed to have changed subtly. Her features, which before seemed young and innocent, now carried a disturbing maturity, as if centuries of experience were hidden behind those dark eyes. "I am not who you think I am," she continued, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks, but tears that seemed loaded with a weight much greater than the suffering of a frightened young woman. "I am a lost soul, Baba, a soul that wanders between worlds for longer than you can imagine." Her words hit Baba Ramit like a physical blow. Decades of esoteric study and mystical contemplation had familiarized him with concepts about lost souls, entities that became trapped between planes of existence, unable to find peace in this world or the next. But confronting such a concept in the reality of his humble cabin was something completely different. "What truth is this, my daughter?" he asked, his voice maintaining the calm cultivated through years of spiritual discipline, even while his heart raced. "For years I have wandered through this forest," Noor continued, appearing to solitary travelers, seeking something I myself couldn't completely understand. I thought I was only seeking shelter, protection, human company. But now, in your presence, in the presence of someone truly holy, I understand the real nature of my prison." She paused, carefully observing his reaction before continuing. "I wasn't running from those men, Baba. I was leading them to a place where their impure intentions could be satisfied. But something about you, about this cabin, about the purity of your intentions, broke the pattern that had been repeating for so long." Noor's confession left the air in the cabin loaded with an almost palpable tension, and Baba Ramit felt that his tranquil and contemplative life had reached a point of irreversible transformation. Noor's words echoed in Baba Ramit's mind, like waves on a previously tranquil lake, creating disturbances that spread in ever-widening circles. During the long moments of silence that followed her confession, the old fakir found himself confronting aspects of his own human nature that he thought he had transcended decades ago. Noor's physical presence in the cabin had awakened in him sensations he hadn't experienced since his distant youth. The subtle perfume of her hair, the delicacy of her movements, the vulnerability she projected, all of this touched strings in his soul that he believed he had silenced forever through rigorous spiritual discipline. 45 years, he murmured to himself, the words escaping his lips before he could contain them. 45 years since a woman stepped foot in this cabin. Noor observed him with those penetrating eyes, and Baba Ramit had the disturbing sensation that she could read every thought passing through his mind. It was as if she possessed an intimate understanding of the weak points of human nature, of the cracks in the spiritual armor that even the most devout carried with them. "Loneliness is a cruel teacher, isn't it, Baba?" she said softly, her voice carrying an understanding that seemed to go far beyond her apparent years. "It teaches us strength, yes, but it also excavates voids in our soul that sometimes we don't even know exist." The fakir felt a chill run down his spine. How could she know exactly where his spiritual defenses were most fragile? During all these years of isolation, he had convinced himself that his renunciation of worldly pleasures was complete and absolute. But now, in the presence of this mysterious young woman, he discovered that his humanity was only dormant, not dead. "You chose this path of isolation out of devotion," Noor continued, rising gracefully and walking to the small window of the cabin, where she observed the rain that still fell gently. "But I wonder, in all these years, have you never felt that perhaps Allah wanted to test not only your ability to resist temptations, but also your ability to discern between genuine compassion and the deceptions of the ego?" Her question cut straight to the heart of the dilemma that Baba Ramit didn't even know he was facing. His compassion for her was genuine, born from decades of spiritual cultivation. But mixed with this compassion, he now recognized other emotions: curiosity about her youth, a subtle awakening of his long dormant masculinity, and something more dangerous, the pride of having been chosen by her as worthy of trust. When Noor turned from the window to face him again, her eyes shone with an intensity that made Baba Ramit question whether the light came from the fireplace embers or from some more mysterious interior source. She returned to her place near the fire, but now her posture had changed completely. No longer the frightened young woman who had knocked at his door, but something older, more knowledgeable of the dark secrets of the world. "Do you want to know how it all began?" she asked, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic tone. "It was a night very much like this one, more years ago than I can count precisely. I was different then, truly young, truly innocent, truly vulnerable." Baba Ramit nodded silently, part of him wanting to hear her story, part of him fearing what she might reveal. "I lived in a small village with my family," Noor continued, her eyes fixed on the embers, as if she were seeing the past unfold in the flames. "I was the youngest daughter, the most spoiled, the one who always got what she wanted with a smile or some well-placed tears. My parents constantly warned me about the dangers of the forest, about the ancient spirits that inhabited the oldest trees. But I was young and stubborn." She paused, and Baba Ramit noticed that her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something much deeper. "One night, after a particularly intense argument with my mother about my rebellious behavior, I fled from home determined to prove that I was brave enough to cross the forest alone. In the heart of the woods, I found an ancient tree, older and larger than all the others, with symbols carved into its bark that seemed to pulse with life of their own." Her eyes met his, and Baba Ramit saw in them a sadness so deep it seemed to have roots in centuries of suffering. "When I touched the symbols, something touched me back," she whispered. "A cold, ancient, powerful presence, a jinn that had been imprisoned in that tree by some long-forgotten sorcerer. He offered me a deal, freedom in exchange for a favor. I would be his vehicle in the physical world, helping him seduce and corrupt holy men until he gathered enough power to completely break his own chains." "And you accepted?" Baba Ramit asked, although he already knew the answer. "I was young and foolish," she replied. "I thought I could control him. I didn't know he would control me." Noor's words still echoed in the cabin's charged air when a terrible sound cut through the night, a roar that belonged to no known animal, a deep vibration that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of the earth. The sound made the cabin's wooden walls tremble, and the embers in the fireplace reignited momentarily in an unnatural blue flame. Baba Ramit rose instinctively, his spiritual training alerting him to a presence that transcended anything he had faced in his decades of mystical contemplation. The cabin's air became dense, almost solid, as if an invisible force were compressing the very space around them. "He comes," Noor whispered, her voice now loaded with genuine terror that contrasted dramatically with the mysterious composure she had demonstrated moments before. "He knows I'm here, that I found someone who can break the pattern." The cabin's temperature plummeted abruptly. Both their breaths became visible in the suddenly frozen air, and a thin layer of ice began to form on the edges of the small window. The flames in the fireplace flickered violently, as if a supernatural force were trying to extinguish them completely. Then, with a crash that made the entire cabin structure sway dangerously, the door burst open. But what entered wasn't wind or rain. It was a presence, a dense and palpable shadow that slowly materialized in the center of the small room. The jinn assumed a form that defied normal human comprehension. It was as tall as two men, with a silhouette that seemed to float between solid and gaseous. Its eyes were red embers that pulsed with their own light, and its voice, when it finally spoke, resonated like the echo of thunder in deep caves. "Ramit," the creature said, and the fact that it knew his name made the fakir's blood freeze in his veins. "Finally we meet face to face." "You know my name," Baba Ramit replied, forcing his voice to remain firm despite the terror he felt. "But I don't know yours." The jinn laughed, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. "I am Malphus, the deceiver, the whisperer of temptations, and you, old fool, have fallen into my most elegant trap." Noor cowered in the corner of the cabin, her young form trembling violently as she watched the confrontation between the holy man and the demonic entity that had controlled her existence for so long. "What trap?" Baba Ramit asked, although a terrible part of his mind was already beginning to understand the horrifying truth. The flaming eyes of Malphus gleamed with cruel pleasure as he slowly circled Baba Ramit, like a predator savoring the moment before the final attack. The creature's presence completely filled the small cabin, making the air vibrate with a malevolent energy that seemed to corrode the very sanctity of the place. "The trap, old fakir," Malphus said, with a voice that echoed with centuries of malice, "was yourself. You and your spiritual arrogance disguised as humility." Baba Ramit felt the creature's words like physical blows, each syllable loaded with a terrible truth he didn't want to recognize. "For 45 years, the jinn continued, you convinced yourself that you had transcended your human nature, that your decades of fasting, prayer, and isolation had completely purified you of all worldly desires. But I see the truth, Ramit. I see how your heart accelerated when she entered your cabin. I see how your eyes lingered on her young form. I see how your mind imagined things that a holy man should never imagine." Each word from Malphus hit its target with surgical precision, exposing the cracks in the spiritual armor that Baba Ramit had built over decades. The fakir felt waves of shame and self-awareness sweeping his consciousness like devastating tsunamis. "She didn't need to do anything but be here," the jinn laughed cruelly. "Your own mind did all the dirty work. How many times during these last hours did you catch yourself thinking of her not as a soul in suffering but as a woman? How many times did you feel that familiar awakening of desires you thought you had buried forever?" Baba Ramit closed his eyes, forcing himself to face the brutal truth of Malphus's words. Yes, he had felt those impulses. Yes, his compassion had been stained by other, less noble emotions. But recognizing this truth only increased his determination not to allow it to defeat him. "You are right," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "I felt those things. I thought those things. But feeling a temptation is not the same as succumbing to it." "Ah," Malphus whispered, moving closer, "but you have already succumbed, old fool. The moment you allowed those thoughts to enter your mind, the moment you felt pleasure in her presence, you had already failed. Corruption doesn't require action. It only requires consent." It was then that Baba Ramit understood the true nature of the test he was facing. In the dark corner of the cabin, Noor watched the confrontation between Baba Ramit and Malphus, with eyes that gradually changed from terrified to something more complex, a mixture of pain, hope, and a growing determination she didn't know she possessed. The jinn's cruel words about the nature of human corruption echoed in her mind, but something in the fakir's firm responses was awakening memories of who she had been before her curse. "No," she whispered initially, her voice so low it was almost muffled by the confrontation between the two. But then, something within her strengthened, as if decades of forced silencing were finally being broken. "No," she repeated, this time with more force. Malphus turned in her direction, his flaming eyes narrowing dangerously. "Silence, vessel, you have no voice here." But Noor was slowly rising, and as she stood, something fundamental in her posture and expression was transforming. The tears in her eyes were no longer from fear or manipulation, but from a righteous anger that had been suppressed for too long. "I have a voice," she said, her voice growing in strength and clarity. "I always had a voice. You just convinced me that I didn't have one." She turned to Baba Ramit, her eyes now shining with their own light that had nothing to do with the jinn's malevolent influence. "Baba, you said something earlier about discerning between genuine compassion and the deceptions of the ego. But I think the real question is, can I discern between my true self and the creature he forced me to become?" Baba Ramit looked at her with sudden and profound understanding. In her eyes, he no longer saw the seductive young woman who had appeared at his door, nor the lost soul who had confessed to him. He saw something he recognized from his own spiritual struggles, a genuine human soul fighting to free itself from chains she herself had helped forge. "Each soul must face its own battle," he said softly, echoing words he had spoken in his prayers for years, but which now gained completely new meaning. "No one can free you, Noor, but someone can remind you that you always had the power to free yourself." Malphus roared with rage, realizing that the carefully maintained control over his prisoner was beginning to fragment in ways he hadn't predicted. Malphus's roar made the entire cabin tremble, but this time Noor didn't cower. Instead, she took a step toward the creature that had controlled her existence for so long, her fists clenched and her breathing heavy with the force of a newly discovered determination. "You told me I was weak," she screamed, her voice cutting through the jinn's supernatural roar. "You convinced me that I needed you to exist, that without your presence I would be nothing but an empty shadow. But you lied." As Noor spoke, a light began to emanate from her body. Not the cold and unnatural light that had characterized Malphus's presence, but something warm and golden, like the first rays of sun breaking through clouds after a storm. The light grew brighter with each word of defiance she pronounced. "I was just a foolish young woman when I made that deal with you," she continued, walking determinedly toward the jinn, who now backed away slightly before her transformed presence. "But even being foolish, even making that terrible mistake, that doesn't define me forever. I can choose who to be from this moment on." Malphus tried to reassert control, extending his shadowy forms toward her like tentacles of pure darkness. "You are mine," he growled, "sealed by agreement, marked by my essence. You cannot simply choose to be free." But when his darkness touched the light emanating from Noor, something extraordinary happened. Instead of being absorbed or corrupted, the light intensified, burning through the jinn's shadowy substance like acid through metal. Malphus screamed in pain, a sound that made the cabin walls crack. "I break this agreement," Noor declared, her voice now resonating with an authority that came not from external power, but from an unshakable internal conviction. "Not through magic or rituals, but through pure choice. I choose to reject the darkness I allowed to enter my soul." Baba Ramit watched in respectful silence, recognizing that he was witnessing something rare and sacred, the moment when a human soul rediscovers its own internal divinity. His silent prayers sustained Noor, but he knew the real battle was hers to fight. The light emanating from Noor intensified until it became almost blinding. Malphus, his form beginning to disintegrate at the edges, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "You don't understand what you're doing," he screamed. "Without me you will die. Your soul has been sustained by my energy for so long that it cannot exist independently." "Then let me die as myself," Noor responded with a serenity that surprised even herself, "rather than live as your puppet for one more moment." With those words, the light exploded outward from her in a wave of pure energy. Malphus was hit full force, his shadowy form dissolving like smoke in the wind. His final scream echoed through the forest before being swallowed by the dawn's silence. When the light finally faded, Noor stood in the center of the cabin, but her appearance had changed completely. She was no longer the manipulative young woman who had arrived during the storm, nor the tormented lost soul who had confessed to Baba Ramit. She was simply a woman, matured by suffering, strengthened by choice, and freed by her own courage. "It's over," she whispered, her legs trembling with the exhaustion of the spiritual battle she had fought. "It's really over." Baba Ramit approached her with the respect due to someone who had just fought and won the greatest battle of her existence. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. "Free," she replied, and for the first time in decades, the word carried genuine meaning. Frighteningly, wonderfully free. The old fakir nodded with wisdom, acquired through decades of contemplation, and now enriched by this extraordinary experience. "Do you understand now why all this happened?" Noor looked through the window, where the first rays of dawn were beginning to filter through the forest trees. "Yes, Malthus wasn't just trying to use me to corrupt you. He was using me to corrupt myself more deeply. Every person I seduced in his name, every soul I helped stain, also stained my own soul. The only way to break the cycle was to completely refuse my role in it. And more than that," Baba Ramit added, "you discovered that true strength doesn't come from external power, but from the willingness to face our own inner darkness and choose the light no matter the cost." Noor smiled, a genuine smile free from the manipulation that had characterized all her expressions for decades. "Thank you, Baba, for not rejecting me when you discovered my true nature, for reminding me that I had a choice." "The choice was always yours," he replied. "I just helped you remember that." When Noor left the cabin that morning, she wasn't running from anything or going anywhere specific. She was simply walking, for the first time in decades, as a free woman, leaving behind footprints that belonged only to her. Baba Ramit watched her until she disappeared among the trees, then returned to his morning contemplation with a renewed understanding of an ancient truth. The greatest jihad, the greatest sacred struggle, is always against our own internal weaknesses, and victory in that battle doesn't come through power or magic, but through the simple and pure courage to choose who we want to be, regardless of who we were in the past. Moral of the story: if the heart is firm in its faith and honest in its search for truth, not even the deepest darkness can permanently deceive. Evil always disguises itself as something attractive, whether through obvious temptations or through our own spiritual arrogance, but it only has power over us if we allow it. This story, although not taken directly from the Quran or Hadith, serves as a parable to strengthen our faith and remind us that the true spiritual battle is fought on the field of our own daily choices. Now share this story in your groups and social networks. Let others also be reminded that not everything that seems fragile is innocent, and that our greatest strength lies in our willingness to honestly face our own fears and weaknesses. Because when we understand that the true struggle is against ourselves, we discover that we also carry within us the power of victory. Write in the comments which part of this story touched your heart the most, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that strengthen the soul and expand spiritual understanding.